The first snow fell early that year, dusting the peaks above Coldwater Creek in white by the third week of September. And that was how Walter Stone knew it was time to ride down for nails and rope before the passes closed for good. He had lived alone in the Elkhorn Mountains of Colorado for 6 years. Since the autumn he buried his wife Mary and their infant son Daniel beneath the big ponderosa pine behind his cabin. And in all that time, he had learned to read the mountain the way other men read newspapers. The color of the aspen leaves, the direction the elk moved, the particular bite of the wind coming down off the granite shoulders of the range, all of it told him a story. And the story that autumn of 1878 was simple. Winter was coming early and it was coming hard. He packed his mule, an old gray gelding named Samson with a temperament as stubborn as its owner's, and set out down the long switchback trail toward town, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. He carried with him a list scratched in pencil on the back of a torn envelope: nails, rope, salt, coffee, a new file for his axe, and beneath the list, in smaller letters, a note to himself that he would need enough of everything to last until the thaw, because once the snow came to the high country, it did not let a man leave again until spring chose to release him. Walter was 34 years old that year, broad through the shoulders from years of splitting wood and hauling traps, with a beard gone the color of iron, and eyes the pale gray of a winter sky. He was not an unhandsome man, though he had long since stopped thinking of himself in those terms, for there had been no one to think of him that way since Mary passed, and a man alone in the mountains does not spend much time considering his own face. He thought instead of practical things of firewood stacked high enough, of traps set and checked, of the low ache in his chest that never quite left him no matter how many winters passed. Coldwater Creek was a modest town, built up along the banks of the creek that gave it its name, with a single dusty main street lined by a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith's forge, a small church with a bell that rang crooked, and a scattering of houses that thinned out toward the foothills. It had grown some since the silver strikes up in the higher canyons 2 years before, but it remained the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where a stranger could not walk down the street without every window curtain twitching at least once. Walter tied Samson outside Pruitt's general store and stepped up onto the boardwalk, nodding to a few faces he recognized. He had never been a man for conversation, and the town had long ago accepted that about him, greeting him with a respectful distance that suited them both. He was halfway through the store's door when the stagecoach came rattling down the main street, dust rising behind its wheels, and something about the commotion made him pause. The coach pulled up outside the stage office with a groan of tired leather and worn axles, and the driver climbed down to open the door. Walter watched, more out of habit than curiosity, as a young woman stepped down onto the dirt street, smoothing the front of a travel-worn gray dress and lifting a small valise that seemed to hold everything she owned. She was perhaps 24 years old, with dark hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet that had seen better days, and an expression on her face that Walter recognized immediately, because he had worn it himself the day he buried his family. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of a life they had not chosen, bracing for whatever came next. Her name, though Walter did not yet know it, was Alice Callahan, and she had traveled 1,100 miles from St. Louis to marry a man she had never met. Walter went inside the store to fetch his nails and rope, and might have thought no more of the woman on the street, had it not been for the shouting that broke out not 10 minutes later. He came back out onto the boardwalk with a coil of hemp rope over one shoulder and a sack of nails in his other hand, and found a crowd beginning to gather near the stage office. At the center of it stood a heavy-set man in a fine coat that did not fit his manners, gripping Alice Callahan by the wrist hard enough that she had gone pale, her valise fallen open in the dirt at her feet. "You will do as I say," the man was saying, his voice thick with whiskey though it was not yet noon. "I paid for your passage, girl, and I will have what I paid for. Mr. Boone, please," Alice said, her voice trembling but not breaking. "You are hurting my arm." Walter had heard the name Boone before. Silas Boone owned a cattle ranch to the east of town, and a reputation that ran ahead of him wherever he went. A reputation built on unpaid debts, cheated hands, and a temper that had put more than one man in the doctor's care. Walter had never had cause to cross paths with him, preferring the solitude of the mountains to the politics of the valley. But he had heard enough from other trappers and traders to know that Silas Boone was not a man to be trusted with anything smaller or weaker than himself. He set down his sack of nails on the boardwalk without quite deciding to do it, and found his boots carrying him across the street before his mind had fully caught up with his body. "Let go of her arm," Walter said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the particular stillness of a man who rarely spoke and meant every word when he did. Silas Boone turned, his grip on Alice's wrist loosening only slightly, and looked Walter up and down with the sneer of a man used to being the largest presence in any room. "This is none of your business, mountain man," Boone said. "This woman is my intended bride, bought and paid for through a marriage broker in St. Louis. Go back to your traps." "I do not much care what business you think it is," Walter said. "I care that you are hurting her and that you will stop." Alice looked up at Walter then, and something in her eyes, not quite hope, but the shadow of it, steadied something in his chest that he had not felt steady in a long time. Boone laughed, an ugly sound. "You want her for yourself, is that it? Fine specimen of a woman, I will admit, worth a bit of trouble." "Let go of her," Walter said again, and this time he took a step closer, close enough that Boone could see there was no bluff behind the words. For a moment it seemed the man might swing at him, and Walter was ready for it, his weight settling low, and even the way it did when a bear reared up on a trail, and a man had to decide in half a second whether to run or stand his ground. But Boone was a coward beneath his bluster, the kind of man who was brave only when the odds favored him plainly, and with the whole street now watching, he thought better of it. He shoved Alice's wrist away from him hard enough that she stumbled, and pointed a thick finger at Walter's chest without quite touching it. "This is not finished," Boone said. "She belongs to me by contract, and no dirty trapper is going to stand between a man and what the law says is his. I will be back for her, and you had best not be standing in my way when I come." He turned and stalked off toward the saloon, and the crowd that had gathered began to murmur and disperse, the way crowds do when the excitement has passed and there is nothing left to see. Walter knelt down and began gathering the spilled contents of Alice's valise, a hairbrush, a small Bible, a folded letter with a wax seal broken open, a photograph of an older man with kind, tired eyes. "Thank you," Alice said, kneeling beside him to help. Her hands were shaking, though she was trying hard not to let it show. "I do not know what I would have done." "You would have managed," Walter said, though he did not entirely believe it. "Folks generally do, one way or another." She looked at him properly then, taking in the buckskin coat, the rifle slung across his back, the general air of a man more at home among trees than people. "You live up in the mountains," she said. It was not quite a question. "I do." "Alone?" Walter hesitated, and something in the hesitation told her the answer before he spoke it. "Alone," he confirmed. She closed her valise and stood, brushing the dust from her skirt with hands that had not quite stopped trembling. "My name is Alice Callahan," she said. "I came from St. Louis. I answered an advertisement for a bride, placed by a marriage broker on behalf of Mr. Boone. I was told he was a respectable rancher of good character." "He is neither," Walter said. "No," Alice agreed quietly. "I have gathered that much in the space of 20 minutes. Walter stood as well, hefting his sack of nails back over one shoulder. He was not a man given to inviting trouble into his life, and every instinct that had kept him alive through 6 winters alone told him to nod politely to this woman, wish her well, and return to his mule and his mountain before the weather turned any worse than it already threatened to. But there was something in the set of her jaw, some quiet dignity beneath the fear, that made those instincts feel suddenly small and unworthy of the moment. "Where will you stay?" he asked instead. Alice's composure faltered for just a moment. "I do not know. I have very little money left, only enough for the return passage, and even that would take some weeks to arrange, and Mr. Boone has already paid the broker for my passage here. I understood the marriage to be settled. I did not think to plan for a refusal." "You are refusing him, then?" "I would rather starve," Alice said, with a flash of the spirit that would come to define her in Walter's memory for years afterward, "than marry a man who grips a woman's wrist hard enough to bruise it within the first 5 minutes of meeting her." Walter found himself almost smiling, an expression his face had nearly forgotten how to make. "Good," he said. "That is the correct answer." It was the town marshal, ordinarily, who might have stepped in to settle such matters, but Marshal Tom Rays had ridden out 3 days prior after a gang of horse thieves working the eastern trails, and was not expected back for a week or more. In his absence, the town's sympathies, such as they were, sided quietly with Alice, though no one seemed willing to risk Silas Boone's temper by offering her a place to stay. Mrs. Prout, the storekeeper's wife, offered her a cup of tea and a sympathetic ear, but confessed that her own husband would not hear of housing a woman who had jilted Silas Boone, not with the ranch's business tied up with the store's ledgers the way it was. "I could sleep in the church," Alice said, more to herself than to Walter, as they stood outside the store an hour later, the sun climbing higher and the temperature, even in town, dropping with the wind that came down off the peaks. "Reverend Alsop would not turn me away, surely." "He would not," Walter agreed, "but Boone would find you there inside a day, and a church door is no lock against a man like that." Alice looked up at him, and Walter saw the question forming before she spoke it, saw too the fear of asking it and the fear of not asking it warring plainly on her face. "The snow will close the high passes within 2 weeks," Walter said before she could find the words. "Maybe less. Once it does, no one comes up and no one goes down, not until spring. If you were to come with me up to my cabin, Boone could not reach you there even if he wished it, not once the drifts piled deep enough. It is a hard life and a lonely one, and I will not pretend otherwise, but it would be safe." "You are offering to take a stranger into your home for the entire winter," Alice said slowly, as though testing the shape of the idea. "I am offering you a roof and a fire and no man's hand upon your wrist," Walter said. "What you make of the winter is your own business. I have a spare room built for storage that I can clear out. You would have your own door that latches from the inside." Alice was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving over his face as though searching for the lie in it and finding none. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "You do not know me, you owe me nothing." Walter considered the question longer than perhaps he needed to, because the honest answer surprised even himself when it came. "Because 6 years ago I could not save the 2 people who mattered most to me in this world," he said, "and I have spent every winter since wondering what use I am, sitting alone on that mountain. Maybe this is the answer. I do not know. I only know that I will not stand by and watch that man drag you off by the wrist and call it marriage." Alice's eyes filled, though she did not let the tears fall, blinking them back with the same stubborn will that had carried her 1,100 miles from a home she had left to save her family from ruin. "Then I accept," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Stone." "Walter," he said. "Just Walter." "Alice," she answered, and something passed between them in the exchange of names, small and quiet, but the first thread of a bond that would grow over the coming months into something neither of them yet had words for. They spent the remainder of that day preparing for the journey, Walter purchasing additional supplies. With the last of the money he had brought a second bedroll, warmer stockings, a few yards of wool cloth Alice might use to mend or make clothing through the winter months, more coffee and flour and salt pork than he would normally have bought for himself alone. Alice sold what few possessions she could not carry, a silver hair comb, a spare shawl, gathering just enough coin to feel less entirely dependent on a stranger's charity, though Walter refused to take any of it toward the supplies. "You will need every cent you have when spring comes," he told her, "should you decide to go home." "And if I decide not to go home?" Alice asked, though she did not look at him when she said it, busying her hands instead with folding a blanket. Walter did not have an answer for that, not yet, and so he said nothing, and the silence between them was not unkind. They left Coldwater Creek the following morning. Before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridges, Alice, mounted on a mare Walter had arranged to borrow from the livery stable in exchange for a promise of pelts come spring, and Walter leading Samson, the mule with their supplies lashed securely to its back. The town watched them go with the particular curiosity of a place that would have a great deal to discuss over supper for weeks to come, and more than one voice was heard to mutter that Silas Boone would not take the insult lying down. Walter had considered that too, in the quiet hours of the night before, lying awake in the loft of the stable where he had bedded down rather than pay for a room he could not afford twice in one trip. He did not believe Boone would follow them into the mountains, not with winter closing in, and a man like Boone unwilling to trade comfort for principle. But he had learned, in his years alone with only the wind and the wolves for company, never to underestimate a wounded man's pride, and he resolved to keep watch on the trail behind them until the snow made such watching unnecessary. The trail up into the Elkhorn Mountains climbed steadily through stands of aspen, already gone gold and crimson with the turning season, then into darker forests of spruce and fir where the air grew thin and cold even at midday. Alice had never seen mountains like these, had grown up in the flat river bottoms of Missouri, where the horizon stretched wide and low, and she found herself craning her neck at every turn to take in peaks that seemed to scrape the underside of the sky itself. "It is beautiful," she said more than once, and each time Walter found himself looking not at the mountains but at her face as she said it, at the way wonder transformed her features from careful composure into something younger and freer. "It is beautiful," he agreed, "and it is dangerous, and you must learn to respect both halves of that truth, or the mountain will teach you the second half the hard way." He was not exaggerating for effect. Twice that first day they crossed narrow game trails where a misstep would have sent horse and rider tumbling down scree slopes steep enough to break bones, and once they paused to let a black bear amble across the path ahead of them, unhurried and indifferent to the two riders who waited, breath held, until it disappeared into the brush. "Will it come back?" Alice asked, her hand tight on the reins. "Not for us," Walter said. "It has better things to eat this time of year, and it knows we are here." A bear that wanted trouble would have come already. By the second day, the trail grew steep enough that they dismounted and led the animals on foot for long stretches, and it was on this second day, crossing a swollen creek swelled by early snowmelt higher up the range, that the rope Walter had bought in town proved its worth sooner than either of them expected. The crossing looked simple enough at first glance, a shallow ford where the water ran perhaps knee-deep over smooth stones, but the current beneath the surface ran faster and colder than it appeared, fed by ice higher up that had begun to give way in the recent warm spell before the real cold set in. Walter crossed first, leading Samson, and called back for Alice to follow the same line he had taken, angling upstream against the current. She was halfway across when her borrowed mare, spooked by a fish or a shifting stone or simply the cold bite of the water, reared suddenly and threw her from the saddle. Alice went under with a cry that Walter would hear in his memory for the rest of his life, the current catching her skirts and dragging her downstream toward a bend where the water ran faster and deeper, toward rocks that would not be kind to a body thrown against them. Walter did not think. He was already moving, unspooling the coil of new rope from Samson's pack with hands that had tied 1,000 knots in 1,000 storms, looping one end around a stout pine at the water's edge and knotting it fast before he waded in himself, the cold hitting him like a physical blow even through his boots and trousers. "Alice," he shouted, throwing the free end of the rope toward the spot where her head broke the surface, gasping. "Grab hold. Grab the rope." She caught it on the second throw, her fingers closing around the hemp with the desperate strength of a person fighting for her life, and Walter braced his boots against a submerged rock and hauled, the rope biting into his palms even through his gloves, until she was close enough that he could wade the final steps and pull her bodily from the current into his arms. She was shaking violently, her lips already tinged blue from the cold, and Walter did not waste time on words, carrying her to the bank and setting her down only long enough to strip the sodden outer layers from her and wrap her in the driest blanket he had, before building a fire with the speed and economy of a man who had built 10,000 fires in worse conditions than this. "You saved my life," Alice managed, once the shaking had eased enough to let her speak, huddled close to the flames with Walter's own coat added atop the blanket around her shoulders. "The rope saved your life," Walter said, though his voice was rough with an emotion he did not examine too closely. "I only threw it." "You are being modest," Alice said, and managed something close to a laugh, though it came out shaky. "I have never in my life been more frightened, and never in my life more grateful." Walter looked at her for a long moment across the firelight, this woman he had known for barely 2 days, and felt something shift in his chest, some old lock loosening that he had thought rusted shut for good 6 years past. "We will make camp here tonight," he said, looking away first, busying himself with the fire. "The horses need rest, and so do you. We will finish the climb tomorrow." They reached his cabin the following afternoon, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs set in a small clearing with a view down the valley that took Alice's breath away nearly as much as the near drowning had the day before, though for entirely different reasons. Smoke rose easily from the chimney once Walter got the stove lit, and by evening the cabin had warmed enough that Alice could remove the heaviest of her outer layers and sit near the fire in relative comfort, watching Walter move about the space with the ease of long familiarity, hanging traps, checking the seal on window shutters, stacking the wood he had split before he left for town. The spare room, once cleared of the crates and tools that had accumulated there, was small but serviceable, with a narrow bed frame Walter built himself that very evening from spare lumber, working by lamplight while Alice sat wrapped in a blanket near the stove, and despite her protests that he need not go to such trouble, found herself deeply moved by the sight of him laboring past midnight to give her a proper place to sleep. "There," Walter said finally, setting the last peg into place and testing the frame's stability with his weight. "It is not much, but it will hold, and I will bring in the extra bedding tomorrow." "Thank you, Walter," Alice said, and the use of his given name unadorned seemed to land somewhere in his chest with unexpected weight. For all of it, the rescue, the room, the kindness a stranger had no cause to offer. "You are not a stranger," Walter said before he had quite decided to say it. "Not anymore." That first week settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite expected, born of necessity but softened day by something gentler. Walter taught Alice the small mechanics of mountain survival, how to bank a fire to hold through the night, how to read the sky for weather, how to render fat for candles and mend torn canvas and set snares for rabbits, though he did the actual trapping himself, unwilling at first to burden her with the harder tasks. Alice, for her part, brought skills of her own that Walter had let go slack in his years of solitude. She mended his shirts with a neatness his own rough stitching had never achieved, organized the cabin's small store of goods with a methodical eye, and in the evenings, when the work was done, read aloud from the single worn novel she had carried in her valise, her voice filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was on one such evening, perhaps 10 days into her stay, that Alice first asked about the small wooden cross visible through the cabin's back window, planted at the base of the great ponderosa pine. "That is Mary," Walter said, after a silence long enough that Alice began to regret asking. "My wife, and our son Daniel, though he was born too early and did not live more than a few hours. Mary followed him a day later. There was a fever that went around that autumn, and the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride, and by the time I could have fetched him, it would not have mattered." "I am so sorry," Alice said softly. "It was 6 years ago," Walter said, though the way his voice caught on the words told her the wound had not healed so much as scarred, the pain gone quiet but never gone entirely. "I built this cabin for the two of them, for a family. And then I buried them both within 2 days of each other, and I have lived here alone ever since because I did not know what else to do with a life built around people who were no longer in it." Alice reached across the small distance between their chairs and laid her hand over his, and Walter did not pull away, though he did not look at her either, his eyes fixed on the fire. "You have carried that alone for 6 years," Alice said. "I have." "You need not carry it alone tonight," she said, and Walter's throat closed around whatever reply he might have made, and for a long while they simply sat together in the firelight, her hand over his, and said nothing more because nothing more needed saying. The days grew shorter, and the nights grew colder as October gave way to November, and the first real snowstorm of the season arrived in the 3rd week of that month, howling down off the peaks with a fury that rattled the cabin's shutters and piled drifts against the door by morning. Walter had seen enough winters to know this was only the beginning, a taste of what was to come, but even he was caught somewhat off guard by the storm's ferocity, and it was during this storm, trapped together inside 4 log walls with the wind screaming outside, that the last careful distance between them began to fall away. They had been playing cards by lamplight, a game Alice's father had taught her as a girl, when a particularly violent gust rattled the door hard enough to make her jump, and Walter, without quite thinking about it, reached over and covered her hand with his own where it rested on the table. "It is only the wind," he said. "The cabin has stood through worse." "I know," Alice said. "I am not truly frightened, only startled." But she did not move her hand away, and neither did he, and the cards lay forgotten on the table between them as the storm raged outside and something quieter, warmer, began to build in the space between their 2 chairs. "Alice," Walter said, and stopped, uncertain how to continue, a man more comfortable with the language of weather and traps than the language of the heart. "Yes," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, some invitation, that gave him the courage to finish. "I did not expect this," Walter said, "any of it. I rode down for nails and rope, and I have thought of little else but you since the moment I laid eyes on you standing in that street. I do not know what to make of it, only that it is true, and I did not think I would ever feel this way again about anyone." Alice's eyes shone in the lamplight, and she turned her hand beneath his so that their fingers laced together properly. "I have thought of little else but you either," she admitted. "I came here a stranger, running from one man's cruelty, and I did not think to find kindness like yours, let alone anything more. But I have found it, Walter, and I would be lying if I said I did not want it." He leaned across the small table then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished it, and when she did not, he kissed her, gently at first and then less so, the storm outside forgotten entirely in the warmth that had kindled between them inside those log walls. That winter, Walter Stone did not sleep the way he had slept the 6 winters before. He lay awake in his own narrow bed, listening to the wind and the settling of the cabin's timbers, and thought of the woman sleeping in the room across the hall, of the way her laughter had begun to fill the cabin, of the particular tilt of her head when she was concentrating on a task, of 100 small things that added up to something he had no name for except that it kept him from sleep as surely as any storm. He did not mind the sleeplessness. He found, in fact, that he had come to prefer it to the empty rest of the years before, when sleep had come easily because there had been nothing in his heart to keep it at bay. Their courtship, if it could be called that in such circumstances, proceeded slowly and carefully, for both of them carried wounds that made trust a thing to be built rather than assumed. Alice told him, over the following weeks, the fuller story of how she had come to answer the marriage broker's advertisement. Her father, Edmund Callahan, a bookkeeper in St. Louis, had fallen ill with consumption 2 years before, and the medical bills combined with a bad investment had left the family deeply in debt, facing the loss of their modest home. The marriage broker had promised a respectable match with a prosperous rancher, and a payment to Alice's family that would clear the worst of the debt. And Alice, the eldest of 3 children and the only one old enough to earn her keep through such a sacrifice, had volunteered before her parents could even fully explain what was being asked. "I did not do it out of romance," Alice said one evening, as they sat together mending a torn shirt by the fire, her stitches now steadier and more confident than they had been her first weeks in the cabin. "I did it because my father was dying and my mother could not manage alone, and I told myself that whatever man awaited me, I could learn to make a life with him for their sake." "And instead you found Silas Boone," Walter said, "who thought a bride was something to be gripped by the wrist and dragged wherever he pleased." "And instead I found you," Alice corrected gently, "though I admit the path there was not the one I expected." Walter thought often in those weeks of the injustice of it, of a system that allowed men like Silas Boone to purchase a bride, the way one might purchase a horse or a plot of land, with no regard for the woman's own will or safety, and no recourse for her if the arrangement proved cruel. He had seen enough of the world beyond his mountain to know Alice's situation was not uncommon, that women arrived on the frontier by the hundreds each year under similar arrangements, and that the law, such as it existed in these remote territories, rarely concerned itself with what happened to a bride once the contract was signed and the money changed hands. It struck him as a wrong that deserved more attention than it received, and he found himself, in the quiet hours of those long winter nights, grateful beyond measure that circumstance had placed him on that street in Coldwater Creek at the exact moment Alice Callahan needed a hand to intervene. December brought deeper snow and colder nights, and with them, a rhythm to the cabin that felt, to both Walter and Alice, less like survival and more like something approaching a shared life. Walter taught her to shoot his old rifle, more for her own confidence than out of any expectation she would need it, and Alice proved a quicker study than he expected, dropping a tin can from 30 paces on her 4th attempt. Alice, in turn, taught Walter dances she remembered from her girlhood in St. Louis, humming the tunes herself since there was no music to be had, and Walter, a man who had never danced a step in his life, found himself laughing, a sound the cabin had not heard in 6 years, as he stumbled through the steps with her guiding his hands. It was in late December, on a night when the sky had cleared enough to reveal a blaze of stars unlike anything Alice had ever seen from the flatlands of Missouri, that they walked together to the edge of the clearing, wrapped in furs against the cold, and stood looking up at the wheel of the heavens. "I used to think I understood the sky," Alice said. "From St. Louis, you could see perhaps 100 stars on a clear night if you were lucky. I had no idea there were so many more hiding above us the whole time." "The mountain shows you things the valley cannot," Walter said. "That is its gift and its price. You see more clearly up here, but you pay for it in solitude." "I do not feel solitary," Alice said, turning to look at him, her breath fogging between them in the cold air. "Not anymore." "Nor do I," Walter said, and drew her closer, and there beneath that vast frozen field of stars he asked her without any particular ceremony whether she might consider staying with him not merely through the winter, but for the whole of her life if she would have him. "I have been waiting for you to ask," Alice said, laughing through sudden tears, "though I confess I did not expect to be asked beneath the stars in the middle of a Colorado winter with my toes half frozen inside my boots. Is that a yes?" Walter asked, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that undid her entirely. "It is the surest yes I have ever given to anything," Alice said, and kissed him there in the snow, the cold forgotten entirely in the warmth that had grown between them. They could not marry that winter, not with the passes closed and no minister able to reach them, but they made a private promise to each other that night, and in the weeks that followed, the cabin that had once felt to Walter like a monument to grief began, slowly and surely, to feel instead like the beginning of something new. January brought a visit that neither of them expected, though Walter had half hoped for it, since it had been some weeks since he had seen any sign of his old friends from the Arapaho band that wintered in a sheltered valley some 6 miles to the north. Two Feathers, a man near Walter's own age with whom he had traded and hunted for years, arrived on snowshoes one clear afternoon with his mother, a woman the trappers and settlers called Little Dove for lack of knowing her true name in her own tongue, though Walter had long ago learned to call her by it properly Wapiti Sage, which meant something closer to Elk Woman in the Arapaho language, though even that was an approximation across the gap between their two worlds. "I heard in the valley that the mountain man had taken a wife," Two Feathers said, grinning, as he stamped snow from his boots at the cabin door. "I did not believe it until I saw the smoke rising different from your chimney. A man alone burns his fire one way. A man with someone to share it burns different. She is not yet my wife," Walter admitted, "though I hope she will be come spring when a minister can reach us." Alice welcomed them warmly, having heard enough from Walter about his friendship with the band to feel no fear, only curiosity and Wapiti Sage, after studying her for a long moment with sharp, kind eyes, nodded once as though confirming some private assessment. "She has a strong heart," the older woman said to Walter. In the mixture of English and Arapaho the two of them had developed over years of conversation. "That is good. This mountain does not forgive weak hearts." It was Wapiti Sage, in fact, who proved invaluable some weeks later when Alice fell ill with a fever that frightened Walter more than any storm or bear encounter ever had, her body burning hot despite the cold, her breathing labored in a way that brought back memories he had spent 6 years trying to bury. He rode the 6 miles to the Arapaho camp through waist-deep snow in the dark, half convinced he would lose her the way he had lost Mary, and returned with Wapiti Sage riding behind him on Samson, carrying a bundle of dried herbs and a knowledge of fevers that no frontier doctor, even had one been reachable, could have matched. "This is not the fever that took your wife," Wapiti Sage told him firmly, seeing the fear plain on his face as she worked over Alice through the night, brewing a bitter tea from her herbs and pressing cool cloths to Alice's brow. "This is a fever of the lungs from the cold and the wet crossing of the creek months ago, settled deep and only now rising. It is dangerous, but it is not the same, and she is strong. She will live, mountain man, if you stop hovering like a crow over a carcass and let me work." Walter did not sleep at all during those 3 days, keeping vigil at Alice's bedside even when Wapiti Sage assured him it was not necessary, holding her hand through the worst of the fever's peak, and speaking to her in a low, constant murmur of everything he hoped for their future together, as though the words themselves might anchor her to this world. On the 4th morning, the fever broke, and Alice woke weak but clear-eyed, and found Walter asleep in the chair beside her bed for the first time in days, his hands still wrapped around hers even in sleep. She woke him gently, and the look on his face when he understood she had truly recovered was one she would remember and cherish for the rest of her life. "You did not sleep," she said softly, "the whole time." "I could not," Walter said. "I was too afraid of losing you to close my eyes." "You did not lose me," Alice said. "I am not going anywhere, Walter Stone. I intend to keep you awake with worry for a great many years yet, I am afraid, though I hope for happier reasons than this." Walter laughed, a rough, relieved sound, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I would not have it any other way," he said. By the time February arrived, Alice had fully recovered her strength, and the cabin had settled into a warmth and ease that felt, to both of them, like the truest kind of home either had known in years. But the peace of that winter was not to last entirely undisturbed, for word travels strangely even through snowbound mountains, and Silas Boone had not forgotten the insult dealt him on that street in Coldwater Creek 5 months before. It was Two Feathers who brought the warning, arriving at the cabin on a bitter morning in late February, with news gathered from a trader who had passed through the Arapaho camp days before. Marshal Reyes had returned to Coldwater Creek in November, and in the course of settling other business, had uncovered troubling information about Silas Boone, namely, that Boone had a wife already, married some years before in Kansas and never properly divorced, a fact the marshal had confirmed through correspondence over the winter months. Boone was to be arrested on charges of attempted bigamy and fraud the moment the roads allowed the marshal to ride out to the ranch. But word had also reached Boone himself of the pending charges, likely through a sympathetic hand at the telegraph office. And rather than wait to be arrested, Boone had apparently decided to make one final attempt to claim what he still considered his property before the law caught up with him. "He rode out 3 days ago," Two Feathers said, "with 2 men, asking after the trail to your cabin. My cousin saw them on the lower ridge trail, moving slow because of the snow, but moving all the same. I came as fast as I could to warn you." Walter's blood ran cold at the news, not for himself, but for Alice, and he set immediately about preparing what defenses the cabin allowed, checking the rifle, barring the shutters more securely, positioning Samson and the mare in the small lean-to shed where they would be sheltered from any stray shot. "You do not have to face this," Alice said, watching him work with a steadiness that surprised even herself, born of the strength she had discovered in herself over the long winter months. "We could ride for the Arapaho camp, wait there until the marshal comes, and leave the cabin to be burned or ransacked by a man's spite," Walter said. "No, this is our home, Alice. I will not run from it, not when Boone has no true claim on you at all, not when the law is already on our side, even if it has not yet arrived to enforce it." They did not have long to wait. Boone and his 2 men arrived at the edge of the clearing that same afternoon, the horses laboring hard through the deep snow, Boone himself looking gaunter and wilder than he had in the fall. Whatever whiskey-soaked confidence had sustained him in Coldwater Creek now curdled into something more desperate. "Alice Callahan," Boone shouted from the tree line, not yet daring to approach the cabin directly, perhaps wary of the rifle Walter had made visible in the cabin's front window. "I have come for what is mine by contract. You will come with me now, or I will burn this cabin down around the both of you." "She is not yours," Walter called back, stepping out onto the small porch, rifle in hand though not yet raised. "She never was, and the law knows it now, same as we do. You have a wife in Kansas, Boone. The marshal has the papers. You are wanted for fraud and bigamy, and threatening folks on a mountain is not going to change either of those facts." Boone's face went through several ugly transformations, at once shock, denial, and finally a raw, cornered fury that Walter recognized as the most dangerous phase of all, the desperation of a man who knows he has nothing left to lose. "You lie," Boone snarled, though the tremor in his voice suggested he knew Walter did not. "I do not need to lie," Walter said. "The marshal is already riding this way, has been since word reached him 3 days past. If you have any sense left in you, Boone, you will turn around now and ride hard for the border before he catches up to you, because if he finds you here, threatening a woman and a man on their own land, the charges against you will only grow heavier." One of Boone's 2 hired men, a lean rider Walter did not recognize, exchanged a look with his companion, and it was clear from the exchange that neither of them had signed on for a hanging offense, only for a bit of easy money escorting a rich man on a personal errand. "Boone," the lean rider said, "if the marshal is coming, I want no part of this. You said this was a simple matter of fetching a runaway bride, not standing against an armed man on a mountain with the law on his side. Get back on your horse and finish the job I am paying you for," Boone snapped, but the rider was already turning his mount, and his companion followed a moment later, the 2 of them disappearing back down the trail without a backward glance, leaving Boone alone at the edge of the clearing, his bravado draining visibly from his shoulders now that his hired muscle had abandoned him. "You would not shoot an unarmed man," Boone said, though it came out more question than statement, his eyes fixed on the rifle in Walter's hands. "I have no wish to shoot anyone," Walter said. "I only wish for you to leave and never trouble Alice Callahan again, That is the whole of what I want from this moment, Boone. Take that offer and ride away, or wait here for the marshal and take whatever the law decides you deserve. The choice is yours." For a long moment, Boone stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, the wind stirring the snow around his horse's legs, and Walter could see the calculation happening behind the man's eyes, pride warring against self-preservation, the last dregs of a bully's arrogance measuring itself against the very real threat of a prison cell. Self-preservation won. Boone spat into the snow, muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse or might have been a broken kind of surrender, and turned his horse back down the trail, riding away without another word. He did not get far. Marshal Reyes, as it turned out, had indeed been riding hard for the mountain, having received the same information from the telegraph office that had prompted Boone's desperate flight. And the marshal's party intercepted Boone on the lower trail not 2 hours later, arresting him without incident once his hired men, already fled, confirmed to the marshal exactly where and why they had abandoned their employer. Marshal Reyes himself rode up to Walter's cabin the following day to confirm the matter was settled, refusing Walter and Alice's offer of coffee only long enough to deliver the news properly. "Boone is in my jail in Coldwater Creek," the marshal said, a weathered man in his 50s with a steady, unhurried way of speaking that put both Walter and Alice at ease immediately. "He will be transported to Denver for trial once the roads clear proper in spring, on charges of bigamy and fraud, maybe attempted kidnapping too, given what you have told me here. He will not trouble either of you again, not for a long while, and by the time he is free, if he ever is, I expect he will have learned better sense than to come looking for either of you." "Thank you, Marshal," Alice said, relief washing visibly through her posture. "I confess I have not felt entirely safe since the day I arrived in Coldwater Creek until this moment." "You have Mr. Stone here to thank for a fair share of that safety," Marshal Reyes said, nodding toward Walter with something like respect. Not every man would ride down for a bit of rope and nails and come back up the mountain with a whole new life waiting for him. "Folks in town have been talking of little else all winter, Mr. Stone, I will tell you that much." Walter felt heat rise in his face at that, unused to being the subject of town gossip, but Alice only laughed, slipping her hand into his without hesitation. "They are welcome to talk," she said. "I intend to marry this man the moment a minister can reach us, Marshal, and I do not care who knows it." "Reverend Alsop will be glad to hear it," the marshal said, tipping his hat. "I will send word down that the roads should be passable within a month or so, given how this thaw is going. You will have your wedding before the wildflowers bloom, I would wager." True to the marshal's prediction, the snow began its long retreat in the final weeks of March, the drifts shrinking day by day, the creek swelling again with meltwater, though this time Walter made certain to cross it with far greater care whenever the errand required it. By the second week of April, the lower trail had cleared enough for travel, and Walter and Alice rode down together to Coldwater Creek, not as a desperate fugitive and her rescuer this time, but as a couple with a wedding to plan. The town, true to the marshal's word, had talked of little else through the long winter months, and turned out in considerable numbers for the ceremony that took place on a bright, clear Saturday in late April, in the small church with the crooked bell, Reverend Alsop presiding over vows that both Walter and Alice spoke with a steadiness born of absolute certainty. Wapiti Sage and Two Feathers rode down from the Arapaho camp to attend, an unusual sight in the church pews that raised a few eyebrows among the more conservative townsfolk, but neither Walter nor Alice cared in the slightest for such opinions, having learned through the winter's trials exactly which relationships mattered and which did not. Alice wore a dress of pale blue that Mrs. Prude had helped her sew from the wool cloth Walter had bought her that first day in town, and Walter, cleaned up and clean-shaven for the first time in years, looked almost unrecognizable to those who had known him only as the solitary, bearded mountain man who came down twice a year for supplies and spoke to no one longer than necessary. "I, Walter Stone, take you, Alice Callahan," he said, his voice steady though his hands, clasped in hers, trembled slightly with the weight of the moment. "To love and to honor in every season the mountain sends us for as long as I live." "I, Alice Callahan, take you, Walter Stone," Alice answered, her eyes bright with tears she did not try to hide. "To love and to honor through every storm and every quiet morning after, for as long as I live." When Reverend also pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause and cheering that seemed entirely too large for its modest size, and Walter kissed his new wife with a tenderness that drew a few appreciative sighs, even from the more hardened ranch hands scattered among the pews. They spent that first summer working together to expand the cabin, adding a proper second room and a wider porch where they might sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the valley. And Walter found, to his own quiet astonishment, that the ache which had lived in his chest for 6 long years had finally, gently begun to ease, replaced by a fullness he had thought lost to him forever. Alice, for her part, wrote regularly to her family in St. Louis, sending what money they could spare from the sale of pelts and the modest earnings of Walter's trapping, and was overjoyed to learn, in a letter that arrived that autumn, that her father's health had stabilized considerably once the worst of the debts were cleared, thanks in part to funds Walter insisted on sending despite Alice's initial protests that it was not his burden to carry. "It is my burden now," Walter told her simply. "Your family is my family, Alice. That is how this works." The following spring, in May of 1880, Alice gave birth to their first child, a son, in the very cabin where they had fallen in love, with Wapiti Sage attending as midwife, her steady hands and calm voice guiding Alice through the labor with the same skill she had once used to nurse Alice back from fever. They named the boy Edmund, after Alice's father, and Walter held his son for the first time with tears streaming freely down his face, thinking of the son he had lost 6 years before and buried beneath the ponderosa pine, and feeling, for the first time since that loss, that grief and joy could coexist within the same heart without one canceling out the other. 2 years later, in 1882, a daughter followed, whom they named Mary, after Walter's first wife, a decision Alice had suggested herself, understanding without needing to be told that honoring the woman who came before her was not a threat to her own place in Walter's heart, but a gift they could give together to the memory of a life that had ended too soon. The cabin that had once held only grief now rang with the sounds of children's laughter through every season, and the small wooden cross beneath the ponderosa pine was tended with fresh flowers each spring by a family that had grown large enough to fill every room Walter had once built for a family he thought he would never have again. Silas Boone served 4 years in the territorial prison in Denver before being released and disappearing from the region entirely, never heard from again by anyone in Coldwater Creek. His ranch sold off to settle his debts, and divided among several smaller homesteaders who worked the land more honestly than he ever had. Marshall Reyes remained the town's lawman for another decade, often telling the story, whenever a stranger passed through and asked about the mountain man and his wife, of the winter Walter Stone rode down for nails and rope and came back up with a woman who would keep him awake every night thereafter, not with worry, but with a love so full it left no room for the old, lonely silence that had once filled his sleep. Walter and Alice Stone lived out the whole of their lives together in that cabin and the town below it, raising 5 children in total between the mountain cabin and a second, larger house they eventually built closer to Coldwater Creek once the children reached school age, so that Edmund, Mary, and the 3 siblings who followed, twin boys named Walter and Thomas, and a youngest daughter named Wapiti in honor of the woman who had saved Alice's life that harsh February, might have the education Alice herself had valued so deeply growing up in St. Louis. Every autumn, without fail, for the rest of his life, Walter Stone made the same journey down from the mountain that he had made in September of 1878, ostensibly for nails and rope, and whatever supplies the coming winter demanded. But in truth, as he told Alice every single year with the same quiet, contented smile, simply to remember the day his whole life had changed on a dusty street in a small Colorado town, when a woman with a bruised wrist and an unbreakable spirit had looked up at him and given him, without either of them quite realizing it yet, a reason to want to keep on living. I rode down for nails and rope, he told their children often in later years, gathered around the fire on winter evenings much like the ones that had first brought their parents together. And I rode back up the mountain with your mother, and I have not had a single night's rest that was not the better for it, not once, not in all the years since. You make it sound as though I kept you awake, Alice would say, laughing, taking his weathered hand in hers just as she had that first winter. When really, Walter Stone, it was you who kept me awake, worrying every storm that you would not come back from your traps in one piece. Then it is a fair trade, Walter would answer. Two hearts kept awake together for the better part of a lifetime, and I would not change a single moment of it, not the storm, not the fever, not even that fool Boone and his contract, because every hardship led me straight to you, and I have never once regretted the road, however hard the climb. And there, in that cabin beneath the shadow of the Elkhorn Mountains, surrounded by the family they had built from the wreckage of two broken pasts, Walter Stone and Alice Callahan Stone lived out their years together in a happiness neither of them had dared to hope for on the day they first met. Two strangers on a dusty street, brought together by a rope, a storm, and a love that had kept them both awake gladly for the whole of their lives.